There is a mountain range in the eastern United States that the Cherokee people did not simply inhabit. They guarded it. For centuries, their elders maintained a strict code of silence around what lay beneath the peaks, what ran under the ridgelines, and what the tunnels carved into the living rock of the Great Smoky Mountains were actually for. Outside, investigators who pressed for answers were redirected. Anthropologists who came too close were handed stories designed to satisfy without revealing. And the few Cherokee men who did speak, who let fragments of the real account slip into recorded testimony, did so only after 1907, when something changed. When a decision was made, quietly and without announcement, that certain things could no longer be kept entirely silent. What they described did not match the official story of these mountains, not the geological story, not the archaeological story, and certainly not the story that appears in the textbooks that have been printed about this region for the last 100 years. The tunnels exist. That is not in dispute. What is disputed is everything else. Who made them, when, why, and what the Cherokee elders knew about the civilization that came before them, a civilization so far removed from the accepted timeline of North American history that acknowledging it would require dismantling assumptions that have been treated as settled fact for generations. This is that story. And it starts not with a discovery, but with a silence that lasted far too long. The Great Smoky Mountains sit along the border of what is now Tennessee and North Carolina. They are among the oldest mountains on Earth, geologically speaking, with some formations dating back more than 300 million years. The Cherokee call this territory Shaconage. Roughly translated, that means land of the blue smoke, a reference to the natural haze that hangs over the peaks in every season, every morning, every dusk. It is a name that sounds poetic until you understand that the Cherokee did not name landscapes carelessly. Their place names were functional, descriptive. Often they encoded information about what a location was used for, or what had happened there, or what it contained. Shaconage was not simply named for fog. The elders knew something about these mountains that they were not prepared to share with outsiders. That much became clear to the first serious ethnographers who came into Cherokee territory in the 1880s and 1890s. James Mooney, the Smithsonian researcher who spent years with the Eastern Band of Cherokee and produced the most comprehensive early documentation of their oral traditions, noted repeatedly in his fieldwork journals that certain subjects produced an immediate and consistent response from his informants. They would go quiet, change the subject, or offer a version of something that felt rehearsed, that had the texture of a sanctioned answer rather than a genuine one. Mooney was thorough enough to record these refusals alongside the information he did receive. He noted that the tunnel system under the Smokies was one of those subjects, that when he asked about the underground passages that several of his informants had referenced in passing, the conversation would pivot. The elders were not hostile. They were careful. There is a difference, and Mooney understood it. He wrote in one entry that he had the strong impression the Cherokee possessed a parallel account of these mountains, one that ran beneath the surface of everything they were willing to say aloud. He never got that account, not fully. What he got were the edges of it, but edges are sometimes enough to trace the shape of what they surround. The Cherokee origin traditions are among the most complex in North America. They describe the world as having been formed by animals before humans arrived, a water-covered void gradually made habitable through a series of interventions by beings who were neither fully animal nor fully divine. The earth itself was pulled up from beneath the water by a great beetle, flattened and dried by a great buzzard whose wings shaped the mountains and valleys of what is now the Cherokee homeland. This is the version most people know. What is less widely known is the layer that sits beneath that account, the stories the Cherokee told among themselves about what they found when they arrived in the Smoky Mountain region. because the Cherokee were not always in these mountains. By their own account, and by the archaeological record, they came to the Appalachian highlands from somewhere else. They were not the first people here. And they knew it. What they found when they arrived was a landscape that had already been worked extensively. The ridgelines have been modified, the river approaches have been managed, and the mountains themselves contain passages, tunnels, chambers carved into the rock in ways that did not correspond to anything the Cherokee had produced or anything their traditions described as the work of human hands. They called the makers of these structures the Nunnehi. The word is usually translated as the immortals, or the people who live anywhere, a reference to their apparent ability to move through the landscape without being seen, to appear and disappear, to inhabit places no living person could access. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Yes. The Nunnehi were described as a people, not spirits, though they were later mythologized into something closer to supernatural beings, as the original account was softened for outside ears. In the earliest layers of the tradition, they were simply the ones who were here before, the builders, the ones who made the tunnels. The tunnels were their roads. That is the phrase that appears in the earliest recorded version of this portion of Cherokee oral tradition, in a fragment of testimony collected in 1907 by the field agent A.C. Seiler during a land survey of the Qualla boundary, the official Cherokee territory in western North Carolina. Seiler was not an anthropologist. He was a federal surveyor. He was not looking for mythology. He was documenting land usage, checking claims, establishing boundaries. And in the process, he sat with several elderly Cherokee men who, perhaps because of his official capacity, perhaps because of his age, perhaps because of something else entirely, began to tell him things that had not been told before. Seiler's notes from these conversations were filed with the Bureau of Indian Affairs and then essentially forgotten for decades. They were not published. They were not analyzed. They sat in a filing box in a federal archive until a researcher named David Hurst Thomas referenced them tangentially in a 1994 paper on Appalachian survey methodology. Thomas was not interested in the content of the conversations. He was interested in the methodology of the survey. But the reference was enough. Other researchers followed the citation. And what Seiler had written down in 1907 slowly became part of a parallel literature, the kind that does not appear in mainstream academic journals, but that circulates among people paying close attention to what the official record leaves out. What Seiler recorded is this: an elder named Sarley Crow, known in English records as Charles Crow, spent approximately 3 hours with the surveyor over the course of 2 days in late September 1907. Crow was in his mid-80s at the time, which would have placed his birth in the 1820s, before the Trail of Tears, before the removal, during a period when the oral traditions of the Eastern Cherokee were still being transmitted in their original form to people who had grown up entirely within that tradition. Crow was, by several accounts, one of the last fluent speakers of the ceremonial register of the Cherokee language, a dialect used exclusively for sacred recitation that differed significantly from everyday speech. What Crow told Seiler, through an interpreter, was that the tunnels under the Smokies were not caves. They were not natural formations that the Nunnehi had moved into and used. They were constructed, deliberately, with tools and methods that Crow could not fully describe because the description had been lost even within the tradition, even by 1907. What remained was the fact of the construction and fragments of its purpose. The tunnels ran, according to Crow, from the highest points in the mountain range to the lowlands in a system of connected passages that allowed movement through the entire territory without exposure to the surface. They were sealed, many of them. Sealed deliberately at some point in the past, the openings closed with a precision that made them invisible to anyone who did not already know where to look. Crow said that the Cherokee had found some of the entrances when they first arrived in the region, that they had explored portions of the system, and that what they found inside had led the elders of that time to make a decision. The tunnels were to be left alone. The decision was not made out of fear, Crow said. It was made out of respect, because what they found inside indicated that the Nunnehi had not simply abandoned the tunnels. They had organized them, catalogued them, left things inside in a manner that suggested they expected someone to return. What things? That is the question Sealer apparently asked, because his notes record the answer, or rather the portion of the answer that Crow was willing to give. Objects of stone unlike any stone found in this part of the country. Arrangements of symbol marks on the walls that went on for great distances. And in the deeper sections where Crow indicated the Cherokee had not gone, where the passages dropped below the water table and required knowledge the arriving Cherokee did not possess, evidence of a scale of construction that he described as being beyond what any living people could accomplish. That last phrase is the one that has attracted the most attention from researchers working in the Tartarian framework, beyond what any living people could accomplish. Because the Cherokee in 1907 were not speaking about technology or engineering in the way a modern engineer would understand those concepts. They were speaking about a scale of ambition, about tunnels that were not just passages but were part of something larger, a system that implied a degree of territorial organization, a degree of centralized planning and resource allocation, that the standard archaeological model of pre-Columbian North America simply does not account for. The standard model says this: the inhabitants of eastern North America before European contact lived in relatively small, relatively mobile communities. The most sophisticated among them, the Mississippian culture, built earthen mounds and managed agricultural territories, but did not produce large-scale infrastructure of the kind found in, for example, ancient Mesoamerica or the Andes, certainly not tunnels, certainly not underground road systems connecting mountain ranges to lowlands. The standard model says this because no such system has been officially documented, officially excavated, officially confirmed. But the absence of official documentation is not the same as the absence of the thing itself. And the more you look at what has been found in the Smoky Mountain region, found and then quietly filed away, found and then explained away, found and then reclassified as natural formations, when the alternative was too disruptive, the more the Seiler notes start to look not like an isolated anomaly, but like a confirmation. In 1929, a geological survey team working in the Smokies under the auspices of the newly formed Great Smoky Mountains National Park Service documented what they described in their field notes as anomalous shaft formations in the upper elevations of the Chilhowee Mountain complex. The shafts were vertical, not horizontal. They descended into the rock at regular intervals over a stretch of approximately 4 miles. The survey team leader, a man named Harold Whitcomb, noted that the shafts appeared to have been intentionally shaped at their upper openings, that the rock around the lips of the shaft showed marks consistent with quarrying rather than natural erosion, and that the depth of at least 2 of the shafts exceeded what his equipment could measure. Whitcomb flagged these shafts as requiring further investigation. That investigation did not happen. The land was formally designated National Park Territory the following year. Access was restricted. The survey notes went into the Park Service archive, where they remained until a Freedom of Information request in 2011 surfaced them as part of a larger document release related to early park management decisions. The shafts are not mentioned in any official geological literature about the Smokies. They do not appear on any map of the park's geological features. They were found, noted, flagged for follow-up, and then absorbed into the bureaucratic silence that surrounds so many finds of this type. The Chilhowie Formation sits on the Tennessee side of the Smokies, in the lower elevations of the main ridge. If you wanted to build an entrance to an underground passage system that connected the mountain highlands to the valley territories to the west, the Chilhowie Zone is exactly where you would put it. The geography makes sense in a way that is almost too neat. The shafts align roughly with the general direction that Tarley Crow described the main tunnel axis as running, from the high peaks northwestward toward the river valleys, toward the territory the Cherokee called the Lowland Roads, toward the area that is now part of the Tennessee River. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. Drainage basin. This is not proof. Nothing in this story is proof in the sense that a laboratory confirmation is proof. What it is convergence. A pattern of independent fragments pointing in the same direction. An elder in 1907 describing a system that a survey team in 1929 found physical evidence for without knowing about the 1907 testimony. Two data points from different sources, different eras, different disciplines landing on the same location and the same general description. That kind of convergence is not coincidence, it is a signal. Now go further back, before the Cherokee, before the Nunahai, into the layer of the tradition that even the Cherokee elders treated as deep time, as something so far removed from living memory that it had become almost mythological even within their own tradition. Because Crow did not describe the Nunahai as contemporaries. He did not describe them as the people who had been here a few hundred years before the Cherokee arrived. He described them as the people from the age before this age, before the current form of the world, before the configuration of rivers and mountains that the Cherokee had known all their lives. That phrasing is important. Before the current form of the world. The Smoky Mountains are old. 300 million years is not a number that means much in human terms, but what it means geologically is that these mountains have been through multiple cycles of uplift and erosion, multiple periods of significant geological change. The mountains the Cherokee knew were not the mountains that existed even 50,000 years ago, let alone during the periods that the Tartarian framework places its civilization. The rivers ran differently, the elevations were different. The passages through and under the range would have been cut through rock that was, in some cases, differently oriented than the rock that exists today. If a civilization had constructed a tunnel system in this region during a period of significantly different geological configuration, some of those tunnels would have been compressed, shifted, partially collapsed by subsequent geological activity. Some would have been sealed by the mountains themselves, independent of any deliberate human effort. And some, in the most stable portions of the rock, would have survived, would have been found by the people who came later, would have been incorporated into those people's understanding of the landscape, and eventually into their oral tradition, as evidence of a people who had accomplished things beyond what any living hands could accomplish. This is the framework that makes the Cherokee testimony coherent, not as mythology, not as metaphor, as encoded geological and historical memory transmitted across an unknown number of generations, preserving in oral form what the stone was also preserving in physical form, waiting for the right moment and the right set of questions to make the connection visible. There is a specific site in the Smokies that researchers working in this area return to again and again. It is in the upper drainage of Hazel Creek, on the North Carolina side of the main ridge, in territory that was largely inaccessible before the construction of Fontana Dam in the 1940s flooded the lower valley and rerouted access roads. Hazel Creek was a settled community before the dam. The families who lived there for generations before the flooding had stories about the upper creek drainage that they brought with them when they were displaced. Stories about a section of rock formation above the tree line that local Cherokee had always refused to discuss. A place where the rock rang hollow when struck, where water did not pool in rain the way it should, where the snow melted from certain sections of ground faster than it melted from the surrounding area, as if something below the surface was generating a modest but consistent warmth. That last detail is the one that has attracted the most sustained attention. Differential thermal output in a geological formation that has no active volcanic component. No geothermal feature that the official survey has ever identified. Just ground that is warmer than it should be, in a pattern that does not correspond to sun exposure or drainage or any other surface level explanation. One explanation, only one, is that something below the surface is generating that warmth, something structural, something with enough mass and enough sealed airspace to retain and radiate heat in a way that the surrounding unmodified rock does not. A tunnel system, a large one, with enough enclosed volume to create a microclimate at the surface directly above it. This is not a fringe idea. Archaeologists studying the underground structures of other regions, the hypocaust systems of the Roman world, the Kanat water tunnels of Persia, the underground cities of Cappadocia in Turkey, have documented exactly this effect. Sealed underground spaces of sufficient size alter the thermal signature of the ground above them in ways that are measurable and distinctive. It is how some of the Cappadocian cities were initially located before excavation. Ground-penetrating analysis detected the thermal anomaly before anyone had confirmed by excavation what was producing it. No ground-penetrating survey has been formally conducted on the Hazel Creek anomaly site. The area is inside the national park boundary. Access for research purposes requires a Park Service permit, and permit applications for subsurface survey work in that zone have historically not been approved. This is a fact, not a conspiracy. The Park Service has a mandate to preserve the surface landscape and a strong institutional preference for limiting subsurface disturbance. That preference has an entirely legitimate basis. It also has the effect, perhaps unintended, of ensuring that certain questions about what is below the surface of the Smoky Mountains cannot be officially answered. The Cherokee who lived near Hazel Creek before the flooding did not apply for permits. They did not need to. They had something better. Continuous, uninterrupted proximity to the landscape over multiple generations, combined with an oral tradition that told them what the landscape meant and what portions of it were not theirs to disturb. And they did not disturb it. Not the upper Hazel Creek formation, not the Chilhowee shafts, not the passages that Sarley Crow described in 1907, sealed and organized and waiting. The Cherokee maintained the policy of the elders who had arrived before them and made a decision: leave it alone. It is not ours. It belongs to something older. That deference is itself a piece of information, because cultures do not maintain multi-generational prohibitions around features of the landscape unless those features have given them a reason to. The prohibition is evidence of an encounter with something that commanded respect, that established in the minds of the people who found it that this was not terrain to be casually explored or repurposed, that whatever had been built here had been built with an authority that outlasted the builders. That kind of authority leaves a mark, not always a visible one, sometimes just a silence. A carefully maintained, generation-spanning, deliberately encoded silence of the kind that Mooney noticed in the 1880s and that Seiler broke through partially in 1907. A silence that is its own form of testimony. Now consider what the broader Tartarian record suggests about North American infrastructure, because the Cherokee testimony does not exist in isolation. It exists within a growing body of convergent evidence that something was constructed on this continent at scale, before the timeline that mainstream archaeology currently accepts. The mound systems of the Mississippi Valley are the most commonly cited piece of this evidence, and they are significant. Cahokia, at its peak in the 11th and 12th centuries by conventional dating, was larger than London at the same time. A city of 10 to 20,000 people, with a planned street grid, monumental architecture, long-distance trade networks reaching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes. Mainstream archaeology accepts this. It is not controversial. What is controversial is the question of where Cahokia came from. What preceded it? What tradition of planning and construction Cahokia's builders were working within when they raised Monk's Mound, the largest pre-Columbian structure north of Mexico, to a height of 30 meters over a base covering 14 acres. You do not develop that capacity overnight. You do not develop it in a generation or even several generations. The ability to organize the labor, the knowledge to engineer a stable earthen structure at that scale, the administrative sophistication to coordinate a city of that size, these are the products of a long tradition. A tradition that predates Cahokia, a tradition whose physical remains are not fully accounted for by the current archaeological framework. The tunnels under the Smokies, if they exist as described, would be part of that prior tradition. Not Cahokia's tradition, necessarily. Something older. Something that the Mississippian builders of Cahokia may have been themselves the inheritors of, working within a legacy of construction and territorial organization that stretched back into deep time. Into the age before this age. Into the period that the Cherokee called the time of the Nunnehi. The geographic logic of a tunnel system in the Smokies within this larger framework is compelling. The Appalachian Range forms the eastern spine of North America, east of the Mississippi. Control of the passes to wisdom through that range means control of movement between the Atlantic coast and the interior lowlands. A civilization with serious territorial ambitions on this continent would have needed to manage those passes, to create reliable routes through and under the mountains that could be used regardless of weather, regardless of seasonal conditions, regardless of the presence of hostile forces on the surface. A tunnel system is not a curiosity in that context. It is a strategic necessity. It is infrastructure in the most literal sense. The kind of infrastructure that a civilization builds when it has been established long enough is confident enough in its permanence to invest in structures that will outlast any individual generation, structures built not for the people who build them, but for the people who will come after, and the people after them, and the people after them. The Cherokee arrived and found the tunnels already there, already sealed, already organized. They made their decision. They waited. They kept the silence. Until 1907, when an old man named Sarley Crow sat with a federal surveyor and began carefully to let the edges of the real account into the record. Not everything. Enough. Enough to trace the shape. Here is what the shape looks like from outside the official frame. A civilization existed in North America in the pre-Columbian period, with engineering capabilities well beyond what the standard archaeological timeline attributes to the inhabitants of this region. That civilization built infrastructure, including underground infrastructure, that was durable enough to survive geological and climatic changes over a period we cannot precisely date, but that is likely measured in centuries, if not longer. The Cherokee, arriving in the Smoky Mountain region from elsewhere, encountered that infrastructure and incorporated their encounter into their oral tradition as the story of the Nunnehi, the people who were here before, the builders, the ones who had left and might return. The physical remnants of that infrastructure persist in the Smokies in the form of sealed tunnel entrances, anomalous shaft formations and thermal anomalies that indicate substantial subsurface structures. Official documentation of those remnants has been systematically incomplete. not necessarily through active suppression, but through institutional disinterest, restricted access, and the bureaucratic momentum of a framework that cannot accommodate what those remnants imply. This is not a comfortable conclusion for the mainstream. It requires accepting that the history of this continent is significantly more complex than the current consensus acknowledges. It requires accepting that there were people here before the people we have records for who accomplished things on a scale that the current framework cannot explain. It requires accepting that the Cherokee, for all the condescension their oral traditions have historically received from academic institutions, preserved a more accurate account of this landscape's history than the institutions themselves have managed to produce. That is not a small thing to accept. But the evidence points where it points. The 1907 testimony, the 1929 survey notes, the Hazel Creek thermal anomaly, the consistent pattern of access restriction that has kept formal investigation from reaching the sites most likely to yield confirmation. And underneath all of it, the older layer, the Cherokee silence itself, the multi-generational, carefully maintained refusal to speak about certain things to certain people, a refusal that is not the behavior of people protecting a myth, but the behavior of people protecting a truth. There is something else, Sally Crow said in 1907, that Seiler recorded, and that has received almost no attention in the subsequent literature. Near the end of their second conversation, Crow said that the decision the early Cherokee made about the tunnels was not permanent, it was conditional. The tunnels were left alone not forever, but until the time when the question would be asked by someone who already knew enough of the answer that telling them the rest would not be dangerous. Dangerous to what exactly is not specified in Seiler's notes. Dangerous to the tunnels themselves, perhaps. Dangerous to the understanding that the tunnels imply. Dangerous in some other sense that Crow either did not articulate or that Seiler did not transcribe fully. But the condition is interesting. The question asked by someone who already knows enough of the answer. That is not the posture of a people protecting a secret from a world that cannot handle it. It is the posture of a people waiting for the world to catch up, waiting for the general level of understanding to reach the point where the specific information they hold can be received without distortion, without dismissal, without being absorbed back into the silence from which it came. We may be reaching that point, not because any single piece of evidence has crossed a threshold, but because the aggregate is accumulating, the convergences are multiplying. The institutional framework that has managed the silence for so long is under more pressure than it has ever been, from researchers working outside the traditional academic channels, from digital archive access that has surfaced documents like the Seiler Notes and the Whitcomb Survey, from the filing boxes where they sat for decades, from a general public that is asking harder questions about what they have been told and what they have not been told about the world they live in. The Cherokee elders waited. They maintained the condition. They kept watch over a system of tunnels built by a civilization that the modern world does not yet fully acknowledge, in mountains that are among the oldest on Earth, in a landscape that still holds more than it has revealed. In 1907, Sally Crow decided that the time had come to start telling part of the story. He was in his 80s. He had carried the tradition his whole life. He chose a federal surveyor, an unlikely recipient, and he let out the edges. The question he was waiting for had apparently been asked. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. We are still asking it, and the mountains are still holding the answer, sealed beneath the blue smoke, in passages that run from the high peaks to the lowlands, built by hands that worked in a time this civilization has not yet learned to see. But we are getting closer. The tunnels do not care how long it takes. They have been waiting far longer than we have been looking.